ჩვენი დღევანდელი პლენარული მოხსენება არის ღერძი, ასე ვთქვათ, შედარებითი ლიტერატურის მე-6 კონფერენციისა. უკვე მე-6 წელიწადია, რაც ილიას უნივერსიტეტში ტრადიციულად ტარდება შედარებითი ლიტერატურის კონფერენცია, რომელშიც საკმაოდ დისციპლინარული კვლევებია ხოლმე წარმოდგენილი. ჩვენი დღევანდელი კინოც მოხსენებელი, პლენარული მოხსენებელი ბატონი კლაუს რინი არის ნამდვილად ინტერდისციპლინარული მკვლევარი, ბატონი პატაჩხეიძე, მისი უშუალო მასპინძელი და კოლეგა უფრო ზუსტად გადაცნობთ მის ბიოგრაფიას, მაგრამ თვითონ ის ფაქტი, რომ ბატონი კლაუსი მუშაობს ლიტერატურის, პოლიტიკის, კულტურის და რა თქმა უნდა სოციალური და პოლიტიკური კვლევების მიჯნაზე, მას ძალიან საინტერესო მოხსენებელს ხდის ასევე ჩვენი კონფერენციისთვის. კონფერენცია დილიდან მიმდინარეობდა 101 აუდიტორიაში, ხვალაც მთელი დღე გაგრძელდება. ბევრი მოხსენებელი აქ არის, ვინც დილით წაიკითხა თავის მოხსენება, ხოლო დანარჩენებს ხვალაც გიწევთ დღის განმავლობაში კონფერენციის სესიებზე თუ დაგაინტერესებთ და საღამოს ამავე აუდიტორიაში იქნება საიტის მოდერნიზმი პრეზენტაცია და მოხსენებლები, ხელოვნებაცოდნეები, ნანა ყიფიანი, მზია ჩიხრაძე, თეა კაბადაძე ისაუბრებენ თბილისის მულტიკულტურული ავანგარდის შესახებ. ეხლა შეიძლება ბატონ რექტორს დიდ მადლობას მოვახსენებ მობრძანებისთვის და ამ კონფერენციის მხარდაჭერისთვის, რომელიც ტრადიციულია ილიას უნივერსიტეტისთვის და იტყვას გადავცემ ჩვენი სხდომის მოდერატორს ბატონ პატაჩხეიძეს და სამოდი ჩვენს თემას.
Just a few words about you. მინდა მოგახსენოთ, რომ ჩვენი ნაცნობობა დღევანდელ კათოლიკურს დაიწყო 1990 წელს, როდესაც პირველად ამერიკის შტატებში და ჩვენი მედაბატონი პრაისის დაცულობა განახლდა 2005 წელს, როდესაც მე ფულბრაიტი ვიყავი იგივე უნივერსიტეტში, კათოლიკურ უნივერსიტეტში. ბატონი რინი იყო დიდხანს პოლიტიკის მეცნიერების კათედრის გამგე, იგი მუშაობდა ჯორჯტაუნის უნივერსიტეტში ერთი ხანობა, შემდეგ უკვე დიდხანს მუშაობს კათოლიკურ უნივერსიტეტში, იგი არის სრული პროფესორი პოლიტიკის მეცნიერებისა კათოლიკურ უნივერსიტეტში, არის ძალიან ბევრი წიგნის ავტორი და მისი ინტერესების სფერო მოიცავს როგორც ფილოსოფიას, ასევე პოლიტიკურ მეცნიერებას, ლიტერატურას, ამაზე კიდევ მოგვიანებით ვიტყვი. იგი არის ხელმძღვანელი ასეთი საკმაოდ ისეთი გავლენიანი ინსტიტუტისა, რომელსაც ქვია ეროვნული National Humanities Institute, უნდა იყოს ეს ქართულად ეროვნული. ის ხელმძღვანელი, აგრეთვე ის არის ფილოსოფიის აკადემიის ერთ-ერთი ხელმძღვანელი ამერიკის შეერთებულ შტატებში. მის ინტერესების სფერო არის ძალიან ფართო. იგი არის სპეციალისტი ბებიტისა და სწორედ მისი ინსტიტუტი ბებიტის ფილოსოფიის ერთ-ერთი შემსწავლელია და წამყვანი ამ მიმართულებით. ის არის ბერკიანელი გახლავთ თავისი პოლიტიკური შეხედულებით. მისი შრომები არის ბენედეტო კროჩეს შესახებ, იტალიელი ფილოსოფოსისა და საინტერესოა ის, რომ პოლიტიკის მეცნიერებაში ამ ბოლო დროს იგი ძალიან ახლოს, ძალიან ისეთი ღრმად ჩაუღრმავდა ჩინეთისა და ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატების ურთიერთობებს და ძალიან ხშირად არის ჩინეთში პეკინის უნივერსიტეტის მიწვევით და იქ ხშირად კითხულობს ლექციებს. მე აღნიშნე მისი ლიტერატურული ინტერესებიდან განსაკუთრებით უნდა გამოიყოს ის, რომ მან 2 წლის წინ გამოსცა რომანი A Desperate Man, რომელიც ძალიან საინტერესო მოვლენაა ამერიკულ ლიტერატურაში და ეხება ადამიანის ბედს, ინტელექტუალი ადამიანის ბედს ჩვენ საუკუნეში, გლობალურ საუკუნეში, როგორ ხდება, თქვათ, უცებ ადამიანის გააღვიძება თუ გამოფხიზლება და როგორ ხდება მისი ახალი თვალთახედვით შეხედვა ცხოვრებისათვის. მე ჩემი ძალიან კარგი მეგობარია ჩვენი ოთახები ერთმანეთის წინ იყო და ძალიან ხშირად მეხმარებოდა ხოლმე განსაკუთრებით იმის გამო რომ ჩვენი მსოფლმხედველობა ერთმანეთთან ახლოს არის კონსერვატიული მიმართულების მოაზროვნეა და ფილოსოფოსი ოღონდ უნდა გავმიჩნოთ ის არ არის ნეოკონსერვატიული მიმართულების პირიქით იგი თავისი შეხედულებებით დაპირისპირებულია ნეოკონსერვატიული შეხედულებებით. მე კიდევ ორი სიტყვას ვიტყვი რამაც დამაინტერესა მის შემოქმედებაში ეს არის ის რომ იგი არის ავტორი ძალიან გახმაურებული წიგნის ამერიკის შეერთებულ შტატებში Common Human Ground. როცა ეს წიგნი მან მიმიტითა და შემდეგ მაჩუქა კიდევაც მე ძალიან გამიკვირდა და მაშინ რომ ვიხარი, იმიტომ რომ ეს თქვათ თეორია თუ ეს მოძღვრება ამ სათაურით იყო მე-19 საუკუნის ბოლოს და მე-20 საუკუნის დასაწყისის საქართველოში, რომლის ერთ-ერთი წარმომადგენელი, რომელიც ილიადან მოდის თქვათ და რომლის ესეთი წარმომადგენელი იყო არჩილ ჯორჯაძე და მე ძალიან მაინტერესებდა რა შეიძლება იყოს საერთო მათ შორის. იცით ჯერ კიდევ ადრე აგერ ქალბატონი ბელა დამემოწმება რენე ველიკი ამბობდა რომ კომპარატივისტიკასო ძალიან უსამართლოდ ესხმიანო თავს რომ გავყოთ ეს general literature and comparative literature ეს ძალიან უსამართლობაა general literature-სგან და general thinking-ისგან კომპარატივიზმზე თავდასხმა და მართალიც იყო იმიტომ რომ მიუხედავად ძალიან ბევრი ბრძოლებისა კომპარატივს ვერაფერი ვერ დაუშავეს და ჯერჯერობით კიდევ არსებობს ეს მიმართულება. ამ თვალსაზრისით ჩემთვის საინტერესო იყო ჯორჯაძისა და ბატონი რინის შეხედულებათა შედარება, რა თქმა უნდა, აქ ბევრი არაფერი საერთო არ არის. ჯორჯაძეს სულ სხვა საფუძვლები ჰქონდა, ეს რინის სულ სხვა საფუძვლებზე გარი საუბრობს ამ საერთო ნიადაგზე, ну თქვათ მისი ერთ-ერთი თეზისია, რომ თანამედროვე მსოფლიოში გართულებანია კულტურებს შიგნით და კულტურებს შორის. ესაა დაძაბულობა რელიგიური და ზნეობრივი აზროვნებასთან დაკავშირებული ცხოვრების ტრადიციულ გზებსა და სამეცნიერო და ტექნიკურ ცივილიზაციასთან დაკავშირებულ არატრადიციულ გზებს შორის. აი ეს დაპირისპირება არის მსოფლიოში, რომ უნდა მოგვარდეს ეს ზოგადი უნივერსალური თვალსაზრისი განიხილავს ამას ბატონი და მოსემსჯელობს. არჩილ ჯორჯაძეს სხვა მიზანი ჰქონდა აბსოლუტურად, მისი მიზანი იყო როგორმე საქართველოში არსებული კლასები შეერთებინა და როგორმე მათ შორის ხიდი გაევა. მაგრამ ერთი რამ საერთო ნამდვილად არის, მე ბევრს აღარ გავაგრძელებ, ბატონი ლაპარაკებს, ეს საერთო ის არის, რომ განსხვავებით თქვათ ლიბერალური ძიებისა of common good აქ არის სხვა მიმართულება არჩეული, ეს არის common human ground. ორიენტირი აღებულია კულტურაზე და ზნეობრივ საკითხებზე, ისტორიაზე და ისტორიისადმი დამოკიდებულებას. ჯორჯაძესთან ასე ნამდვილად არ არის, მაგრამ საინტერესო ის არის, რომ მიუხედავად იმისა, რომ მაშინ საქართველოში პოზიტივიზმი და მარქსისტული შეხედულებები რაღაცა მეფობდა და დომინირებდა, იგი მაინც ძალიან ბევრს ლაპარაკობს თავის თეორიაში ენის საჭიროებაზე, ლიტერატურის საჭიროებაზე და რელიგიის საჭიროებაზე და ზნეობის საჭიროებაზე. ამ თვალსაზრისით რაღაცა საერთო კომპარატივიზმი სწორედ ამიტომ არსებობს, რომ განსხვავებაც უნდა გახდეს საერთოს და ხო რაღაც საერთო აქ მაინც დასაძებია. დღევანდელი მოხსენება ბატონის არის ძალიან საინტერესო მულტიკულტურიზმი და მულტიკულტურულ ურთიერთობებს ეხება, მე მგონია რომ დაგაინტერესებთ და ეხლა მას გადავცემ სიტყვა და ხო. You're welcome now.
Thank you. Dr. Magnificus, members of the faculty, students, and guests. I feel honored to be, in this case, sitting before you, and I want to express, particularly to Ata, my appreciation for the hospitality which I've already been shown. I've heard about Georgian hospitality, but this hospitality has gone beyond what I had plausible reason to expect. My subject is, and I think that's what Ata said, multiculturalism and the problem of transcultural unity. Humanity faces no greater challenge in the 21st century than averting conflict among peoples and civilizations. It is curious and revealing that supposed experts in international relations and political science generally seem not to be greatly worried that this century might see the war that will make all previous wars look minor. The deteriorating relationship between China and the United States, and more arrogance and obduracy in the Middle East are but the most obvious possible sources of a great conflagration. Superficiality in defining the dangers or delay in addressing them could have horrendous consequences. Yet discussions of how to minimize conflict typically neglect what may be the most important part of the problem. In the West particularly, it is common to assume that general enlightenment will remove obstacles to peace. This despite the fact that we need only look to the century preceding this one, the most murderous and inhumane in human history, to recognize that the spread of supposedly sophisticated ideas in science does not reduce the intemperance, belligerence, or cruelty of human beings. It only provides them with new means of asserting their will. Many in the West expect that certain political and economic arrangements will promote peace. Democracy and markets being perhaps the two most popular at the moment. They think that universal suffrage and economic interdependence will be salutary. Many hope that international law and agreements and increasing the influence of the United Nations will keep the peace. Behind some prescriptions for lessening tensions, there lingers a sentimental notion of the brotherhood of man. As fellow human beings, can't we just hug and celebrate our wonderful multicultural diversity? Those who consider themselves more realistic favor balance of power theorizing. But most attempts to deal with the problem of conflict gloss over or do not deal in any depth with what may be the very core of the problem, man's moral predicament. Proceeding from a dubious or incomplete understanding of the basic moral terms of human existence, scholars and others exaggerate what elaborate, clever international arrangements or techniques can do to lessen conflict. The trouble is that when passions run high, even the most efficacious measures can be swept away in the blink of an eye. Tensions among cultural groups can very easily get out of hand. In fraught, very tense circumstances, peace will have a chance only if the actors involved are not only experienced, knowledgeable, and creative, but capable of withstanding in themselves, as well as others, the onrush of rashness, belligerence, ethnic nationalistic fervor, or hatred. Such urges can be tamed in the end only by strong character, including habits of restraint and caution. You want peace? Then you need peaceful individuals. One of the factors that presents a major challenge in any serious discussion on how to create peace is the problem of multiculturalism. This has always been a difficult problem, But today its acuity and gravity are compounded by globalization. Increasingly, groups that are culturally disparate and potentially incompatible are brought into closer contact with each other. Is there any way to reconcile this potentially explosive diversity with harmonious relations? Is any kind of transcultural unity possible? To address this question more than superficially, it's necessary to take up a subject that is for the Western intellectual elites of today not only unfashionable, but positively unpalatable. It is a subject that requires a kind of profundity and subtlety of mind that is currently rather unusual. It requires depth and breadth of understanding in philosophy, history, and comparative culture, in ethics, aesthetics, and epistemology. The subject, pardon me, to which I am referring is the moral and cultural preconditions of peace. In a discussion of how to lessen tension, this could be the most important topic of all. The reason is, first, that efforts to avoid conflict are likely to be unsuccessful unless those involved have a certain kind of will and imagination. Second, the relative importance of other aspects of how to deal with conflict are best assessed in light of the most complete view of what makes human beings tick. That the subject of the moral and cultural preconditions of peace receives far less attention than other topics seems to me a sign that Western intellectuals may not be well equipped to deal with the most pressing problem of the new century. Upbringing and education in the West urgently need to be significantly revised. The factors that are typically studied by international relations experts do undoubtedly affect behavior, but that does not excuse us from considering that the key to the quality of human conduct may be character. Whether a political actor will employ his resources and abilities nefariously or responsibly will ultimately depend on whether the actor is predisposed to indulge or transcend dubious passion. Only by examining the basic moral terms of human existence is it possible to get to the bottom of how conflict might be averted. To have the time to set forth a thesis about this subject, I can here do little more than hint at the philosophical basis for what I'm about to argue. I defended my assumptions at great length in writing, notably in the books of Common Human Ground, whose subtitle is Universality and Particularity in a Multicultural World, and another book, Will, Imagination, and Reason. Let me say immediately that in exploring the issue of morality, we must, partly because we find ourselves in a globalizing age, guard against intellectual provincialism, presentism, and other myopia. We need to repair to the resources and historical experience of mankind. We must be willing, at minimum, to question the prevalent view of modern Western intellectuals that moral values are merely subjective, or the notion that moral beliefs are just the idiosyncratic creatures of historical circumstances. If we think more internationally and historically, a different possibility emerges. Amidst a wide variety of beliefs in the human past and present, the open-minded scholar finds what looks like a shared, if variously expressed, sense of higher values, a universal dimension. The ancient Greeks called these values the good, the true, and the beautiful. The great moral and religious systems give primacy to the good, that is, to moral universality. In these traditions, ecumenical research finds far-reaching transcultural and trans-historical agreement on what is the central problem of human existence. that the human will is cleft between higher and lower potentialities, and that man is his own worst enemy. National arrogance and economic ruthlessness are among the obvious and palpable threats to international harmony. But they are but instances of a more general danger, which is that societies and their leaders, instead of interacting on the level of what is morally, aesthetically, and intellectually noblest in each, will interact at their worst, when most self-absorbed, grasping, and intense. Enlightened self-interest, as opposed to crude, short-sighted self-interest, can go a long way towards keeping competing parties from clashing. But a coincidence of inherently partisan wills provide no stable and lasting basis for peace. That popular and other Western culture is today spreading around the world creates a commonality of sorts, but is a fragile, very questionable like-mindedness. This spreading culture is almost uniformly disdainful of the moral and cultural traditions of mankind, including those of the Western world, and it is perceived by many as a threat to their most deeply held beliefs. Because of its crudities and vulgarities, it antagonizes rather than appeals to the more discerning and discriminating representatives of the peoples of the world. To the extent that peoples and civilizations display their least admirable characteristics, closer contact among them may result not in comity, but in their recoiling from each other, a reaction that is bound to be exploited by political opportunists looking to increase their power. People thinking about how to alleviate conflict must face the difficulty that even the most well-laid plans are forever threatened by every type of self-indulgence. Bipartisan passion, arbitrariness, ruthlessness, cruelty, ignorance, short-sightedness, and always the importunate desire for power. Particular historical and social circumstances, such as ethnic tensions, frequently create or aggravate conflict, but the chief obstacle to cordial relations among individuals, groups, and societies is the flawed character of man. Human beings are forever prone to less than commendable desires and tend to shrink from the moral effort necessary to contain it. No observation would seem to be more richly confirmed by the historical record than that human beings are morally torn to the core between higher and lower potentialities. Yet, this crux of the human predicament is strangely denied or ignored in most Western attempts today to find a way to harmonious and just arrangements. One thinks, for example, of the long influential moral rationalism of a John Rawls, with its propensity for a wholly ahistorical ratiocination. The Rawls, who has been widely celebrated, would have human beings step behind the veil of ignorance and consider policies without regard to how they might affect them personally. Reasonableness would then preside over deliberation, and justice and harmony would be served. The same fondness for abstract theorizing and reluctance to think historically and concretely marks theories of so-called communicative or deliberative democracy. Sound policy and harmony are expected to emerge from never-ending conversation that excludes no legitimate groups. There's something very abstract and even dreamlike about these theories. They assume, what must not be assumed, that human beings are interested in listening to competing views. They're not. They want their own way. They think of opposition as annoying and as something to be overcome. What these theorists do not realize is that when people do show a genuine willingness to consider the ideas of others, it is because they have learned to control the passions that would close them down intellectually and in other ways. Openness of mind presupposes a special, rather sturdy moral self-discipline and habituation. The framers of the US Constitution set up a system that would encourage debate and compromise. But the framers were acutely aware that for this system to work, those active within it would have to be capable of self-restraint and be willing to respect the views of others. Their system had demanding moral and cultural preconditions. A certain character type, I like to call it the constitutional personality, had to be available if genuine deliberation were to take place. The more recent theorizing about how to achieve communication and harmony do not explore in depth how to create the moral and cultural conditions favorable to deliberation, dispassionate judgment, and compromise. Exhibiting ahistorical and sentimental leanings, theorists simply assume that when people operate in a more progressive, egalitarian setting, they will be spontaneously predisposed to reasonableness and to hearing the arguments of others. This is wishful thinking. Theories of this abstract, rather dreamy type have limited value in discussions of domestic politics, and they're wholly inadequate for international relations. What is needed is a more realistic, robust understanding of the real sources of open-mindedness and civilized conduct. In the end, only moral character, supported by general culture, can fortify the self in man that wants openness to argument and respect for others. It used to be regarded as the central purpose of civilization to assist individuals in reining in their least admirable traits, so that more admirable ones could be developed. Only protracted moral and cultural exertions and habituation, encouraged by the surrounding society, can bring forth people of this kind. In proportion as the people of a society fall short, they undermine not only their own well-being and the cohesion of their society, but international relations. Until fairly recently, it was taken for granted by most of the Western world, as it was in the East, that human beings are torn between desires that enhance existence and ones that, though they may bring short-term pleasure, are destructive of a deeper meaning and are potentially diabolical. To realize what the ancient Greeks called eudaimonia, happiness, the person must learn to discipline his appetites of the moment, try to extinguish some of them, with a view to his own enduring higher good. Happiness does not refer to a maximization of pleasure, but to the special sense of well-being and self-respect that attends living nobly and responsibly. It is for the sake of this higher life that a person often forgoes momentary pleasures and advantages. Now, the good life has many aspects and prerequisites: moral, intellectual, aesthetical, political, and economic. But there was widespread agreement in the old Western society, whether Greek, Roman, or Christian, that realizing life's higher potential ultimately depends on the person's character, his quality of will. A person who lacks the strength to act rightly cannot achieve happiness by dint of intellectual brilliance, imaginative power, or economic productivity. According to the old Western tradition and corresponding traditions in the East, society should encourage the kind of working on self that will build meaning and worth into personal and social existence. Whether the goal is the happiness and nobility of a worldly life, of the kind that Aristotle and Confucius advocate, or the special piece of holiness in which religion culminates, There's no substitute for the protracted, often difficult effort of will. Note carefully that the most important measure of progress is the quality of actions performed. A quotation that you may recognize: "I am the way and the life and the truth." Jesus of Nazareth. The statement implies that its validity could be tested only in practical action. In Buddhism, the right way, the path, is the diligent working on self to extinguish needless or destructive desire. In the Dhammapada, which is attributed to it in its general spirit to the Buddha, we read about the path to nirvana, and I quote, "You yourself must make an effort," unquote. In the West, the most radical and influential challenge to this view of man's moral predicament came from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was, among other things, the main intellectual inspiration for the French Revolution and for the French Jacobins, who spearheaded the French Revolution that started in 1789. For Rousseau, the old view of human nature is profoundly mistaken. Man is not chronically torn between good and evil. There are in man's own nature no lower inclinations, certainly no original sin, as Christianity alleges. Man was born good. In his primitive, pre-social, natural state, man was pure, simple, peaceful, and happy, and that remains his nature. The evil in society is due not to some perversity in man, but to perverse norms, habits, and institutions. Destroy that society, and man's goodness will be released. Rousseau and his many followers pioneered a revolution in the understanding of morality that continues to reverberate. To summarize the change, virtue ceased to be a matter of character and right willing. It became primarily a state of feeling and imagination, an attribute of the heart. Rousseau gave prominence to tearful empathy, pity, as a sign of human nobility. The old measure of moral virtue was loving, responsible action. Good conduct was the outgrowth of sometimes painful self-scrutiny and a diligent working on self. But for Rousseau, man was good by nature, so that there was no need for man to be on guard against his own lower impulses and to discipline self. Neither was there any need for traditions, social groups, or institutions to buttress morality. On the contrary, it was by liberating man from such traditional constraints that natural goodness would reassert itself. Rousseau and his followers shifted the central struggle of human existence from the inner life of persons to the social and political arena, where the virtuous had to defeat evil forces. Rousseau's redefinition of morality, which by itself had a profound influence in the modern world, coincided historically with a kind of rationalism that seized the initiative with the Enlightenment. Its conception of reason was heavily slanted in the direction of mathematics, geometry, and natural science. Representatives of the Enlightenment rejected the traditional view of man as superstitious and unscientific. They had no place for ancient moral wisdom. A happy life was not dependent on moral character, but required a fundamental restructuring of society according to Enlightened ideas. Rousseauistic sentimental idealism and Enlightenment rationalism might seem to be wholly different approaches to life, but they became close and frequent allies. Both belittled the need for moral character. Selfishness, ruthlessness, avarice, and conflict were not due to any chronic human weakness, but could be overcome by remaking the social and political exterior. Sentimental idealism and rationalism came together in social engineering. Dreamy idealistic visions of the future providing the goal and inspiration, and technocratic manipulation providing the method. In the area of international relations, sentimental virtue and technocratic thinking eventually combine in the idea of an enlightened and vaguely egalitarian global culture, often summarized in the term democracy. According to this ideology, the historically evolved characteristics of peoples, societies, and civilizations will soon give way to a proper transnational ideological homogeneity. History will end. This notion of emerging global harmony neglects central issues, most importantly the issue of moral character. Equally troublesome is the presumption that persons, societies, and civilizations should give up their traditional distinctiveness. Let me suggest, to the contrary, that what might actually be the most conducive to cordial relations is to cherish, not disdain, historically evolved identities, though to cherish them in a particular manner. It is not contradictory or even paradoxical to view this respect for historical particularity as a kind of cosmopolitanism. It is a cosmopolitanism that would encourage particular persons, societies, and civilizations to be themselves while living up to their own highest standards. The cosmopolitanism I have in mind affirms both cultural distinctiveness and pan-cultural unity, which it can do because, in my understanding of them, each is anchored in the same or a similar moral and cultural strategy. In order to assist peace, political, economic, scientific, and other efforts to reduce conflict must be informed by moral realism, most especially by a recognition of the need for leaders to have self-control and a corresponding cultural sensibility. I call this approach to peace cosmopolitan humanism. I hasten to add that something that should be obvious, that sometimes cultural diversity expresses provincialism, intolerance, and brutality, and is a major source of conflict. Diversity is not humanized by moral and other universality, but manifests self-absorbed eccentricity. If it's that kind of diversity that engenders friction and instability. Nationalistic arrogance and bullying caused terrible upheaval and suffering in the last 2 centuries. The great problem with what is ordinarily called multiculturalism is that it is quite unable to distinguish between diversity that enriches and diversity that degrades human life. For example, most postmodernists simply reject the distinction between good and evil, higher and lower. Some of them advocate a more playful approach to life. But we teach children not to play with matches. The history and culture of a people is the source of its social cohesion, outlook on life, and sense of direction and self-worth. Its past shapes its present in countless ways, some of which are not even visible to the superficial eye. Every people has less than admirable traits of which it would do well to try to divest itself. But it also has admirable qualities and great achievements in which it can take pride. These must be absorbed and appreciated anew by each generation. Efforts in the present to improve society need to be adapted through creativity to the historically evolved cultural heritage. A people cannot give its best without being itself. To impose on a people a supposedly superior pattern of conduct that is only alien to its traditions produces disorientation and a split personality. The alien patterns can only produce mechanical and artificial imitation, while putting the people at odds with its deepest sources of self-respect and meaning. What needs to be understood is that when people in different societies develop what is most admirable in their culture, they may at one and the same time be cultivating their own heritage and a common human ground, namely to the extent that their work is inspired by the universal values of goodness, truth, and beauty, as apprehended in their cultural setting. As they enrich their own society in this manner, they strengthen their ties to other people. Though inevitably marked by the distinctive past and present of their particular society, their cultural effort are, in their expression of man's higher humanity, a bridge to equivalent attempts in other societies. Expressed as it is, or as it must be in particular times and places by unique individuals, genuine human universality has nothing to do with uniformity. It consists of universal qualities adapted to historical circumstances. The adaptation is affected by human creativity that synthesizes the universal and the particular. Cosmopolitan humanism is based on the recognition that many different historically formed cultural identities and individual creative acts can manifest one and the same higher quality of inspiration and aspiration, though obviously more or less successfully in particular cases. Representatives of different cultures can come together as fellow human beings, not despite, but through their cultural individualities, the latter sharing not all particulars, but the same quality. Cosmopolitan humanism, if I try to summarize, is then simultaneously and indistinguishably something that cherishes the unity of purpose that is intrinsic to pursuing life's higher values and the diversity that must characterize attempts to realize them. Moral and cultural activity at their best affirm the unity by harmonizing and enriching the unity. This humanizing discipline contrasts sharply with universality that is understood as distinct from and even opposed to particularity, as abstract rather than concrete, particular, and living. In the Western world especially, it is widely assumed that a culture of enlightenment, democracy, and equality is far along in supplanting the ancient moral and cultural traditions of the world. But supposed progressives seem not to realize the extent to which social and political arrangements that they deem desirable and even take for granted, including respect for individual rights, rule of law, freedom of speech, and association, freedom of speech and association, and tolerance. These actually evolved from the old moral, spiritual, and cultural traditions that progressives deem expendable or even unacceptable. Many of their plans for society and the world are largely parasitic on old character traits that they have no plans for trying to preserve. They want behaviors of a certain kind, but do not attend to their moral and cultural preconditions. If there's any truth about human nature in the ancient moral and religious traditions, the progressive mind ignores or downplays the greatest threat to domestic and international peace, namely, that man is his worst enemy. This is the case not only as enlightened intellectuals might conceive, in that man is sometimes less than fully rational, but also in that he's prone to letting egotistical passion and rashness run roughshod over conscience. Leaders and people are able to show the appropriate self-restraint, or leaders and people who are able to show the appropriate self-restraint are such because they are in the habit of scrutinizing and purifying their own motives. Protracted moral and cultural effort have shaped their character, limiting the self-indulgence that puts them in conflict with others. The effort to humanize existence has many aspects: intellectual, aesthetical, political, economic, and so on. But ultimately, they all depend on the individual moral struggle with self. Socio-political arrangements can aid, but not take the place of this struggle. Because historical circumstances vary so greatly, societies are bound to differ in how they approach and express respect for higher values. Yet, as previously discussed, there is among the ancient civilizations of the world a remarkable confluence of moral and cultural sensibility. It includes far-reaching agreement about what constitutes admirable human conduct and good leadership. From China to Europe and the United States, there's a rough consensus on the attributes of the great man or gentleman. He's first of all a person of moral integrity. Of particular relevance in this discussion of prospects for cordial relations is the belief that the exemplary person exhibits self-restraint, humility, modesty, dignity, and good manners. The ancient Greeks warned against hubris, against the belief that you're one of the gods. For Christianity, the greatest sin is pride. Our primary moral obligation is not to condemn the weaknesses of others and demand that they improve, but to attend to our own weaknesses. Christianity roundly condemns the conceit and moral evasiveness of always finding fault in others. In the words of Jesus of Nazareth, quote, "Take the log out of your own eye first, and then you will be able to see and take the speck out of your brother's eye." Unquote. The notion of universality that I associate with cosmopolitan humanism contains no implication that persons, peoples, and civilizations should conform to a single model of life, or that universality can be imposed by means of political engineering. It may be helpful to contrast genuine universality with a type of universalism that is today particularly common and influential in the United States. I'm referring to an ideologically intense variant of the Enlightenment mindset that has been already discussed. This universalism assumes that a single political system is desirable and even mandatory for all societies, and that it should be everywhere installed through military means, if necessary. I've called this ideology the new Jacobinism. The French Jacobins summarized their putative universal principles in the slogan, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. They saw France as the redeemer of nations. The new Jacobins speak of freedom and democracy, and they have anointed the United States. It's important to understand how radically that form of universalism departs from the older Western tradition. An example may be useful. Although proximate in time, the ideas behind the U.S. Constitution of 1789 and those behind the French Revolution of the same year are fundamentally different. The framers of the Constitution held a view of human nature and society that was essentially classical and Christian, whereas the French Jacobins were inspired by Rousseau. According to the classical and Christian traditions, moral virtue is indistinguishable from personal care. It is first of all a form of self-rule. It means subduing and ordering the passions. Jacobin virtue, by contrast, is primarily and directly political. It is a sense of moral superiority, of being right, of being a benefactor of mankind. Because it thinks of itself as a desire vastly to improve the lives of others, this virtue feels itself entitled to the power needed to change the world. This virtue, then, is not a wish to control and improve self, but a wish to control and improve others. Far from curbing the will to power, Jacobin universalism feeds and stimulates it. The U.S. Constitution assumes a need for the opposite, to restrain power, that of the people as well as that of their representatives. America's leaders were not interested in ideological crusading. They hoped to set a good example for others, not impose their will on them. But the new Jacobins radically reinterpret what they call America's founding principles. These principles belong to all mankind, they assert, and they justified armed global hegemony. The U.S. Constitution granted to the central government only limited and shared sovereignty. It left power for the most part in state and local institutions, and above all, with the people themselves in their private capacities. The purpose of the constitutional arrangements was unity in diversity. The union of states would help harmonize and draw strength from diversity, not abolish it. Because Neo-Jacobin universalism favors abstract ideological homogeneity and disdains particularity, it runs counter to old American attitudes and Western traditions. In practice, as well as theory, abstract universalism means a lack of respect for regional or local diversity and for the special needs and opportunities that they reflect. It does not follow that the most common form of modern multiculturalism, with its cult of diversity and its so-called historicism, offers a humane alternative to abstract universalism. By its frantic and therefore disingenuous denial of universality, postmodernism makes history chaotic. Without a unity or continuity of human experience, no consciousness could exist. There could be no history, only wholly disjointed and therefore meaningless experiential fragments. It is different with what I call cosmopolitan humanism. Though it recognizes and affirms the variety of human existence and its inevitably contextual, contingent, historical character, cosmopolitan humanism sees particularity as potentially expressive of universality. In political theory, the school that most sharply attacks historicism is that of Leo Strauss. Interestingly, postmodernism shares with anti-historicist universalism, whether of the Straussian or the Neo-Jacobin variety, the assumption that universality and particularity are incongruous, incompatible. The postmodernists attack universality in the name of radical historicity. The anti-historicists disparage historical particularity in the name of ideological universality. Neither side recognizes the possibility of synthesis of universality and particularity, a potential that is central to cosmopolitan humanism. The dialectical and synthetical relationship of universality and particularity may be suggested in the most general terms. The good, the true, and the beautiful do, in a sense, in a special sense, lack specific form. They are magnetic qualities that an infinite number of yet-to-be-completed moral acts, philosophical thoughts, and works of art may have. But in a different sense, the good, the true, and the beautiful exist for us only in historical particulars. They have been embodied in countless acts, thoughts, and works of art. In loving, morally responsible behavior, wise books and lectures, outstanding poems and compositions, which come alive in the present as we relive and try to absorb them and let them inspire more of the same. Far from being an ahistorical, abstract standard, genuine universality must be freshly discovered by individuals and peoples for themselves in their time and place. It must find expression in concrete particulars. The resulting variety enriches and deepens man's historical existence. Because universality has no other opportunities for articulation than the historical circumstances of persons, it can have no single manifestation, only have a single qualitative form. Although true universality creates qualitative affinities across borders, it is inimical to a global uniculture. Goodness, truth, and beauty reveal the common human ground as they claim and show themselves in the uniqueness and distinctiveness of persons, peoples, and civilizations. This kind of particularity harmonizes diversity. It makes for a more than flimsy and transitory unity. When persons, peoples, and civilizations cultivate their selfhood at the highest level, their efforts are not only compatible with unity, they are the unity, an expression of the common good. To the extent that unity is possible among human beings, it is achieved through diversity. It should be possible to see why cosmopolitan humanism is indistinguishable from patriotism. That is, from a proper love of one's own society. The genuine patriot, as distinguished from the self-absorbed, arrogant nationalist, cherishes what is admirable about its own traditions, as judged by transnational universal standards. Without the patriot's deep rootedness in his own culture's sense of goodness, truth, and beauty, he would not have the preparation and sensitivity to appreciate comparable efforts in other societies. Moral, intellectual, and aesthetic phenomena from around the world that strike rootless, ill-informed, ill-prepared observers as having nothing in common are found by the patriotic cosmopolitan to be both qualitatively kindred and intriguingly, appealingly different. To formulate the conclusion of my argument in a different way, there is a form of multiculturalism that is very different from what is normally meant by that term today. This higher multiculturalism is compatible with, is positively conducive to mutually respectful relations and transcultural unity. It cherishes both the diversity and the common human ground, recognizing that they're different aspects of the same thing. Multiculturalism without the element of cosmopolitan humanism is radically different. It throws gasoline on the smoldering fire. Cosmopolitan humanism contrasts sharply with the prescription for regional or global unification that are advanced by people who have no deep cultural roots and who for that reason are at home in no particular place and have no love for particular people and places. For such pseudo-cosmopolitans, no truly human ground exists, and no truly transcultural appreciation is possible. Peace has to them no special moral and cultural preconditions, but is expected to come into being nevertheless through social engineering. The dominant breed of bureaucrat exemplifies the type. Just as this person has no strong attachment to any country, so does the person have scant interest in history, and even less in the philosophically demanding issue of morality and culture. The typical bureaucrat makes do instead with a smattering of trendy ideas. It is anomalous and potentially very dangerous that people with little familiarity with and even a strong prejudice against the moral and cultural traditions of mankind tend to set the tone in discussions of how to achieve better international relations. The technocratic and presentist cosmopolitanism is not merely ill-conceived. It positively undermines prospects for lessening tensions by diverting attention from what peace and unity most require. Namely, that persons, peoples, and civilization put a resilient check on self-absorption and arrogance and cultivate what is best in their traditions. To stress that need is to make a central philosophical point, but it is first and foremost an urgent call for greater realism in addressing the problem of peace. It is realism in keeping with the shared moral and cultural heritage of humanity. It should be added that if people in the West and elsewhere are to come to a better understanding of the dangers they face and how to deal with them, education and upbringing will need a major overhaul. Thank you. I would be most interested in hearing your comments, questions.
There are many questions that can be asked, but I will try to concentrate on what I consider to be the most essential ones. First of all, when describing certain convergence in the ancient world among different cultures, Hebrew or Greek or Chinese, and what many scholars call the Exo age, would you not consider the possibility that there is a second convergence closer to us, closer to the present, which is kind of based in this actual age, but still develops its own completely different dynamic, but shows certain convergence as well, called of course modernity. And then some of its traits could be those which you have criticized, some less so, but still there is a certain comparable unity, which of course has its roots in the more ancient period. That will be the first question. And the second question goes a little bit into a different direction. You have described how universality and particularity should be considered together, so that we should see universality through the particular, which I find a very sympathetic idea. But the problem is now how you formulate this universality, in what language. Does the language in which this universality is formulated has its own certain autonomy? Are the languages infinitely translatable into each other? Is the content transferable from one language to another without problems? If not, then we are stuck with a certain problem that you formulate values or ideas in one language or in one cultural context which cannot be translated without loss into other contents. And since you don't assume the possibility of formulating this universality outside of each or every cultural context, what do you consider its status to be? I mean, do you think that each culture is translatable into another infinitely and without constraints, without obstacles? That this will be my two questions.
Well, they're very good questions. Now, what popped into my mind as you formulated your first question is that nowadays everybody's talking about historicity. And when I first started hearing this language coming from, broadly speaking, the postmodernists, I said to myself, well, it's about time that they discover that is, that we are all unique, we have our distinctive backgrounds. And so it is true what they say, that no two persons can read the same novel in the same way. Of course. And you might say that this is something that contemporary philosophy and aesthetics has added to the understanding of universality and particularity. When I read what is being said about historicity, I say to myself, but there's not anything here that is new. I'm a student of Benedetto Croce, who is an historicist. He will say, as the postmodernists do, that all is history. It doesn't follow, and this is the great mistake of the postmodernists, that if you are to recognize historicity, you have to jettison universality. As a matter of fact, I would grant this, that it's certainly better that the postmodernists started to talk about historicity, alerting people to the fact that we're all unique. It's about time that somebody did that. But it's very unfortunate that they would, while doing this, assume, and for this there's no reason, to assume that if you recognize historicity, you must give up universality. So yes, in a sense, all insights have to be restated by people in their time and place. And there's no philosophy that does not add something. I mean, even Rorty and people like that may have things to contribute, although I don't see that it's all that important, because it was said already, without the problem of denying universality. Can we translate anything created by human beings in another setting? Perhaps you are familiar with Giambattista Vico. Now, Vico is the one who argues that there is nothing that human beings have created that other human beings cannot, if they give it their ultimate effort, can recoup. Which the important question is it worth the effort to recoup all of the ideas that are occurring? Here, I think one would do well to have a prejudice in favor of certain ideas that keep recurring. Did Plato and Aristotle have the same view of universality? Most certainly not. They're very different. Is Confucius the same as Aristotle? Most certainly not. But they were on to things. They were trying to express something that can be recreated. It can be brought alive. Now, I mentioned Leo Strauss. He has this, I would say, almost primitive view of what philosophical ideas are. He believes that what we should do as philosophers is study the great philosophers and read what they wrote meticulously, as if the meaning of the Republic is all in the text of the Republic. Now here, I think a good thing was done by the postmodernists. They point out that no such thing is possible. If we restate, recreate Aristotle, we are, in a sense, looking fresh at the philosophical problems that he dealt with. Okay. So in what language does one express insight? It has to be expressed in the language that's understandable to people who live at a particular time. And this is not necessarily losing a lot in translation, because what is being translated is not itself finished. Was Plato finished thinking about anything? Of course he wasn't. That would mean that he was not a member of the human race. And if he was not finished, of course, we cannot be finished. The point I'm making is that, yes, we have to find a way to revive the notion of universality. And some things may not work. I think it's inevitable that if that terminology is used, many people will associate it with Enlightenment rationality. And that's just about the opposite of what I'm talking about. Maybe the word universality is not the best one to use. It's shorthand for something very complex.
No, it seems to me that in search for conditions, in search of possibility and conditions of world peace, you go way beyond currently existing institutions, or if not outright ignore the rule in this issue. And you try to search them in spheres like morality, ethics, cultural dialogue, etc. But if we agree on these values, if we agree that certain morality or certain ethics are needed on national and international levels for world peace to occur, then I think the question of institutions will stand anew. What are the institutions which will allow us to enforce, or how to say, to spread these values and morals? And so that's my question. What do you think are from existing institutions, or what do you think could be institutions that can enforce and spread these values, ethics, morals, so on?
The good and the true and the beautiful have not been definitively defined by anyone. Mm-hmm. And yet the Greeks felt the need to have terms to suggest that there's something over which, in a sense, we do not have control. Beauty defines itself. But that does not mean that people are going to experience these universals in the same way. They will forever be discussing who comes the closest to articulating what needs to be articulated. Will there ever be agreement that, yes, Bach is superior to Beethoven? No. And here I come to something that is not palatable to modern intellectuals. Modern intellectuals, on the whole, do not know their traditions. They are highly specialistic, specialized. I say specialistic when they are almost deliberately excluding from considerations things that do not interest them. To be qualified, even to discuss the good and the true and the beautiful, you have to do a lot of work. The Neo-Jacobins, in a way, makes things simple for everybody. Democracy is the thing. Everybody knows mankind has been searching for the proper social and political order for all of these millennia, and now we know what it is. Here it is, and they offer a brief definition. Now that is the sort of thinking that a simplistic mind might conceive. And if you look at the Straussian way of reading text, that is to read the text, close the door to everything else, and concentrate on the text itself, that is a conception of what philosophical thought is, that is simply, well, it's simplistic. But is it appealing to, let's say, doctoral students in political theory? Can you imagine how easy it is to write about the Phaedo? You write a dissertation that is a sort of a paraphrase of the Phaedo. You stay within the text itself. And you have probably at your disposal the definitive translation of the Phaedo. You know, there's one of those ideas. The definitive translation. I know that there are a couple of people here who are working on translation. There's no such thing. And why is that so? Because the philosophers themselves were not finished. I mean, they had to put something down. Maybe they had a publishing deadline, but they knew I sort of skirted this issue. I need to get back to it. So no philosopher has ever felt, well, I'm done now, and it's just a matter of other people getting on the same wavelength. What I'm saying by all of this is that if you're going to have a meaningful discussion of the good and the true and the beautiful, you have to get ready. And it will take a huge effort. For example, do you suppose that a Chinese could hope to make a lot of progress understanding Aristotle without knowing Confucius, his own tradition? No, he would be aided by his command of Confucius in understanding Aristotle. Do you suppose a person can understand the Muslim faith without being deeply rooted in his own Christian culture? Very unlikely. But to put matters in this way is to declare in so many words, we have a lot of work to do. We need to get educated, and we need to become different people. Now that is, of course, what the Western world will not take seriously. That perhaps the key to understanding the good is to become a different human being. And you asked about institutions that might be conducive to expressing these universal values. First of all, the institutions have to be adapted to the circumstances of time and place. But to think about the institutions is a matter of understanding what went before, so that you know what the historical situation is in which you are acting. The past lives, only we don't do much by way of exploring what's in it. Now, Benedict Croce says that all history is contemporary history. Why do we ultimately study history? Because we want to know about ourselves. And we all approach particular ancient thinkers with some need of ours governing our reflections. Now, just exactly what institutions will be most conducive to enliven, refresh culture, who can say in advance? The Americans would have had a very hard time envisioning political good without constitutionalism. Why? Because they have the Christian and classical view of human nature. Human nature needs to be very carefully watched. You need to create institutions that will put a premium on deliberation, genuine deliberation. As I mentioned in my talk, people don't want to hear other arguments. They really don't. And if somebody starts to persuade them of something that they really don't want, I have an expression for it. Maybe some of the faculty here know what I'm talking about. The yawn of escape. I have long experience observing the yawn of escape. I'm not talking about people yawning. We're not supposed to yawn in front of others in any case, but people who yawn are not doing it in the context in which I'm talking about because they're sleeping. No, they're listening to something that they do not want to hear. And unless something radical has happened within them, the next day, the whole argument is going to be gone. We do not want to hear other arguments. And what can repair by way of institutions, what can make it more likely that we will listen? I think the framers of the US Constitution had the idea that if we put together a system of checks and balances, if we have strong constitutional structures, the odds are that the deliberate sense might have a chance. Now, I like the fact that you put the emphasis on institutions, not because I think that the good and the true and the beautiful are a matter of institutions only. That's the Rousseauistic mistake. But because goodness, truth, and beauty without the concrete manifestations are not the good, the true, and the beautiful. Have you ever met the good and the true and the beautiful in the abstract? Somebody might try to define it for you. Is that going to persuade you of the existence of goodness, truth, or beauty? No. But if you hear, having gotten prepared, a symphony by Beethoven, you're going to say, this is so compelling that I need a word to talk about it. Surely universality was expressed here. So the institutionalization in that case was a symphony.
It seems to me, derived from your very interesting report, that differentiation and unity, which is a basis of cosmopolitanism and humanism, doesn't belong only to human beings. Diversity and unity is the principle of life. And if we consider life in a more wide sense, we can consider the whole world a life system. And that differentiation, unity, is the principle of existence of world. And in this case, we can find the more deep basis for cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism doesn't reflect only the multicultural relations. Cosmopolitanism reflects the structure of the world, the structure of existence, because the whole world is arranged according to the principle of differentiation and unity. And in this case, we can consider the moral law doesn't belong only to human. Moral law is a principle of existence of world. And we can consider it, we can enlarge this moral law, and in this case we can find more deeper, more convenience argument for cosmopolitanism between nations. And if we consider the subject as a moral precondition of peace, as you like in your report, in this case, the great achievement of American Constitution is that to reach the unity, we should articulate the subjective existence of individual. We should not lose the individual in our unity. Just the contrary, we should articulate the subjective unity of the individual person to reach the unity, because it corresponds to the structure of the world as an existence.
I'm not sure I've fully understood you. The emphasis seems to be on unity and what it is and how our apprehension of it can be strengthened. Is that right?
Unity?
Well, what is the nature of the unity? I resist very strongly the idea that the unity might be in the form of a ready-made scheme. Now, Thomas Aquinas was a complicated thinker, and he's no one thing. But I think it was unfortunate that he and many of his followers, the neo-Thomists, were entirely too prone to an abstractionist view of the unity. They thought that we might, as it were, think ourselves into heaven. Reason. Unity is something that is understood primarily by reason. Now, I'm not attributing this to you. I'm struggling a little bit to understand what you were saying. There's no disagreement with you on the importance of unity, but what is its kind? I don't think that moral rationalism, whether it's Platonic or Thomas Aquinas, gets us quite as deeply into the issue as might be possible. But am I wrong in guessing where you're coming from?
To me, it is very strange thing, the unity, because unity is not rational. I don't mind the rational unity. I think that unity is something which is beyond rationality. It is unity of differences. The more we are different to each other, the more we understand each other. The more we are common, we can understand each other. So this understanding is up to communication. Communication is impossible without difference.
Well, if I understand you, I think I agree with that.
So difference is the basis of unity. To keep the difference keeps unity.
Yeah, that's what I was arguing.
Just the basis of unity.
But it is diversity or difference that is, shall we say, magnetically connected to a common human ground.